One of the things which is a feature of the last several years of my career as a head teacher and now as an advisor, school advisor, has been the number of job interviews that I've had to conduct, getting new staff in, and the number of appraisals that I have to do. And if you've been on either end of any of those situations, you'll know that a very common question in that scenario is the one that goes, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? And of course, it's one of those questions which it's really difficult to answer, isn't it? You know, I've been there on the interview when it's been asked to me, and you kind of think, well, I don't want to go overboard, make it sound like I think a bit too much of myself, but I don't want to be sort of underplay it either. And I had one candidate who was fresh out of college and was applying for his first ever job. And I asked that question, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? And he looked across the room at me and said, well, I quite like your job. I was rather taken aback. For one thing, I didn't know there was going to be a vacancy in 5 years' time. And given the fact that so far in the selection process he'd shown no aptitude to actually be able to teach, we had a bit of a problem. Needless to say, he didn't get the job. But in some ways it's an unfair question, isn't it? Because, you know, we know how unpredictable the future is and how things change. And yet it's one of those things which we all have to engage with all of the time. What is it going to be like tomorrow, a year's time, 10 years' time? What does it look like? And of course that can be, the answer to that can be a really joyous one. I spent the first half of this week down in Bath with my 2 new grandchildren, which is fantastic, you know. It's one of those things in life that does live up to all the hype, being a grandparent. It's great, you know, all the positives, and then, as they always say, you hand them back at the end of the day. It's fantastic. But, you know, in there, well, that's that conversation. Oh, you know, which nursery are they going to go to? Where's your local school? And the kids are saying to us, well, when are you moving down to Bath to look after them during the holiday? And all of these kind of things. But it's great. It's a real positive conversation, is it, looking forward into the future. But actually there's so much about when we look forward, isn't there, which is not as joyful as that, which is frightening, which is challenging, which puts us at unease, which scares us. We look at the world political situation at the moment, which seems just kind of, people seem to just be turning everything upside down and around about, and it just feels so unstable. And we don't know what's going to happen. But I think most of us are concerned, at least. And some, I'm sure, actually find that quite frightening. What about the church? I mean, Mark was talking about this morning, wasn't he? The terrible state that the Church of England is in at the moment. And just when you think it can't get any worse, it does. And things just keep piling on and on and on, and kind of almost at times feels like it's in self-destruct mode. And the church more widely in this country. And as Christians, we face this kind of agenda, don't we, to get on board with thinking and ideas that run contrary to what the Bible says. And we face this idea of looking into the future. What's the future for the church in this country? What will it be like to be a Christian in this country in 2035, 2045? And beyond? It's quite a concern, isn't it? It's a difficult question to have to face. Well, as we turn to these final few verses in Haggai, we find that Haggai's final message from the Lord to the people is one that looks forward into what is to come. So far, Haggai's message has been to the people in the here and now, hasn't it? About what they need to do. These people who have returned from the exile, perhaps full of joy and excitement about the idea they're going back to their land, to their city, but then they've run into the sheer hard reality of what they find there. A broken city. people in absolute opposition to everything they want to do, this idea of rebuilding the temple, and the whole thing falls a bit sort of flat and doesn't happen. And Haggai comes and puts God's call to the people to put God back at the centre of their life, to build the temple, that visual sign of God's living in and through his people. And some of that excitement, some of that zeal, so it returns and the people respond to that message. But what comes next? So look out. You know, you can imagine the people there in Jerusalem. Great, this is fantastic, but actually, we're still under Persian rule. Okay, things are all right at the moment, but we know how things can change just like that. That opposition that got in our way for so long is still there. Those people don't want this to happen. They don't want us to be here. It's still a problem. What is going to happen as we move forward? And it's Haggai's words at the end here from God bring reassurance. Haggai's last sermon looks forward into that and reminds the people, these Jewish people, of some key things about God that they needed to know as they look forward. And I'm going to split them into four. We're going to look at God's sovereignty, God's judgment, God's faithfulness, and God's grace. First of all, then, let's look at God's sovereignty. When we look at this passage in Haggai, I think it just leaps out at you from the page, from the words here, doesn't it? God's sovereignty. We look at some of these statements that are in here, these I statements. What is this? God speaking through Haggai to Zerubbabel. I am about to shake the heavens and the earth. I am about to destroy the strength of kingdoms. I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, for I have chosen you. You know, see how definitive those statements are. This is God speaking, and there's certainty here, isn't there? This is what God is going to do. And this is the word of reassurance. And the first one, I'm about to shake the heavens and the earth. It echoes words that have already been said. You can read them earlier in chapter 2. You know, it doesn't matter who you are, does it? Whether you're the king of Persia, or whether you're the president of the United States, or the president of Russia. When the earthquake comes, there's nothing you can do about it. There is nothing you can do. And God says, I am about to shake the heavens and the earth. It's a statement of absolute power, isn't it? It's a statement of God's sovereignty. Now, you could kind of maybe think, well, that's a great thing to say, but how can we be sure? Well, in the way that it's expressed, there's plenty of reminders there for the Jewish people to lock onto. The language that God gives Haggai, he says he's going to overthrow the throne of kingdoms. He's going to overthrow the chariots and riders. And that word overthrow has so many references back to Israel's history, where God has overthrown enemies. But particularly, it resonates back to what we read in Genesis 18 and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, when those cities of such wickedness were overthrown. And they're gone. And it's quite a harsh thing, isn't it? It feels very harsh to us. But God moves in power and sovereignty, and they're gone. And then we read about the riders and the chariots, and the riders and the chariots going down. Well, if you're here this morning, I was so tempted, Helen, to ask you to bring your pieces of fabric and your horses, and we could reenact the parting of the Red Sea part 2. If you were here this morning, you would have seen that. I wasn't quite sure who we'd nominate to play Moses, though. But there's that reference back, isn't there? Reminding the people of the time when the Hebrews just come out of Egypt. And there they are on the edge of the Red Sea. There's no way forward. And they look behind them and they see the power of the Egyptian army charging towards them. What do you do then? That's despair, isn't it? And God moves and he puts the cloud of his presence between them and the Egyptians, and the Red Sea parts and the people go through, and then the Egyptians follow them and boom. God acts on behalf of his people in absolute sovereignty. And so God makes this, in this statement, we see this sovereignty of God. And it's done through with these reminders of the things that have happened in the past. And it just makes me think how often we need to be reminded of that. We've sung about it this evening, haven't we? Several times. But sometimes it's one of those things that sticks up here, doesn't it? And doesn't necessarily drop to here. To know the sovereignty of God, to have that assurance as we look out into our world. Of course, hand in hand with sovereignty comes judgment. The two really go together. They can't be split. What happened at Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't just about sovereignty, it was about judgment, wasn't it? It was about God judging those wicked cities. When it comes to the Exodus and Pharaoh, here was a person who thought himself greater than God himself. And he met judgment. When God moves in sovereignty to overthrow the powers of this world, it is not a benign act. It will not be a benign act. And what's referenced here are fearsome acts, aren't they? Isn't it the cry of every generation? Where is God? Why do these things happen? Why do the wicked people seem to get away with it? You can see, understand that the people here in Jerusalem are looking out at their people who've oppressed them for so long. What's going to happen and why do they get away with it? Well, the God of all sovereignty will bring judgment. They will be dealt with completely. Evil in all its forms will one day come face to face with the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. And that should bring us reassurance, shouldn't it? Because those who think they can run the world in their way, who want to take us away from the things of God, who put that kind of pressure on us, who do things which are just evil, will one day be face to face with the King of Kings. Now, within this passage, this is the promise. But there's a little bit of an issue here, isn't there, in the timing of it. And that it talks about, the words here says, I am about to. Now, I don't know about you, but when someone says, I'm about to, I've got an idea that it's happening in the next 5 minutes, hour, day. Yeah? It's going to happen, isn't it? And yet, actually, what do we know about the history? We know that the Jewish people never again live free of foreign rule and some degree of oppression. The Persians gave way to the Greeks. The Greeks gave way to the Romans, who eventually sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. So in what sense have we got about to here? What is this alluding to? And I think it's kind of one of those things which we see quite often in prophecy, particularly in the Old Testament, of the kind of now but not yet. Things that have their starting point now, but actually we see their fruition later on. And they come to their fulfillment later on. And that brings us through to the third point, God's faithfulness. And to look at that, we need to look at the person of Zerubbabel himself and of the signet ring. Now, I'm sure, we have some familiarity with what a signet ring is. The signet ring, a sign of authority. The king's signet ring, the ring that shows the kind of badge of office that shows their right to be there, that they have that authority. And of course, sometimes a king or a ruler might give their signet ring to someone else to wear, to say that you go in the name of the king, and what you say has the king's authority. But there's something really key about this, and I wonder if you can turn to page 650 in your Bibles with me to Jeremiah chapter 22. And pick up at verse 24 there of Jeremiah 22. And it says this, it says, "As I live, declares the Lord, through Coniah and the son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah." That's not through, that's a bad changes the meaning of the passage completely. "As I live, declares the Lord, though Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim and king of Judah, were the signet on my right hand, yet I would tear you off and give you into the hand of those who seek your life, into the hand of those whom you are afraid, even into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of the Chaldeans." Coniah is Zerubbabel's grandfather, the king in Judah at the time when exile begins, when Nebuchadnezzar takes over the land. Because of the evil and the way that people of Israel had turned their backs on God's way. And what does it say here? Though you're king of Judah, even if you were the signet ring on my right hand, I would tear you off. See what's happening there? God, it's symbolic, isn't it, of God's removing his presence, removing his authority from the people of Israel because of where they had, what they'd been doing and how they're behaving, and going into exile. It is, in a sense, the people of Israel have broken the covenant, and God saying, enough is enough. How can you any longer be my people? So when we get to Zerubbabel and Haggai's message, which says, "O Zerubbabel, my servant, declares the Lord." Sorry, read this properly. "I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and make you like a signet ring." We see God's faithfulness coming back and renewing that sense of covenant that's there. God's never actually moved away from the covenant, has he? He's always been faithful. God's faithfulness, but the people needed to go through that experience. And here they are. Here we see that relationship being restored, that covenant relationship being put back into place. You are God's people moving forward. And then we look at the person of Zerubbabel himself. And again, quick check through another part of the Bible. First chapter of Matthew here. Those verses at the beginning of Matthew that no one ever reads. We jump to verse 18, don't we? The birth of... Do we read the genealogy?
Yeah.
Okay. I knew someone would say yes. And we start with the genealogy. And what do we find? The genealogy that goes from Abraham via David through to Jesus. And what's there in verse 13? We see the name of Zerubbabel. So Zerubbabel is in the line of David. That covenant with David that says that it's going to come together in the person of Jesus, the promise of the Messiah. Can we see how that's coming together now? You know, that God's faithfulness, God's commitment to his people, and his commitment to his covenant and his promise. Here it is. Here's the now. Zerubbabel, I call you as my signet ring. That relationship, God's people, that's going to find its fulfillment here in the person of Jesus and at the cross. So that Paul, writing to the Colossians, can say this. If I can find the beginning. And you who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven all our trespasses by cancelling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands, that he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. It all comes together, doesn't it? In that covenant promise at the cross, where these rulers and authorities are disarmed. God's faithfulness to his people, a God who keeps his promises, who keeps his covenant, so that those of us who are now can be reassured that when we look out on a world which in some ways seems so opposed, we know that God is not going to let us down. We know he's going to keep his promises. We know that these powers and authorities which seem so insurmountable to us are already defeated. And we know that one day Christ will come again. And they will bow the knee to the King of Kings. Finally, I want to look at just this God of grace. Because through all of this, all this promise, all this wonderful stuff is given to a people whose history is to turn their back on God. That's what the exile is all about, isn't it? You know, it's a people who were anointed to be God's people and have said, actually, we prefer to do it our own way. Do they deserve any of this? No. But God in his faithfulness and God in his grace restores that relationship, restores those people, and says, I will keep my covenant. That's grace, isn't it? That is grace. And that is the God of grace that we have. So when we look out at our world and we worry and we doubt, and we do, we need to remind ourselves of these kind of truths. And it's not straightforward. I cannot stand here this evening and say to you, every time I watch the news, I go, hallelujah! You know, God is King of Kings. I don't. I watch things and they frighten me sometimes. And we need to remind each other, don't we, that our God is sovereign. Our God is just and will come in judgment. Our God is faithful, and our God is a God of grace. Let's pray.